The afternoon sun blazed down on the military parade ground, casting sharp golden rays across the perfectly aligned rows of soldiers. Brass bands played patriotic tunes that stirred pride in the hearts of every man and woman present. Flags rippled in the wind, medals gleamed like fire under the sunlight, and the air seemed to vibrate with ceremony. At the center of it all stood General Hale, a man whose very name carried weight in the United States Army. For 3 decades, Hale had been a soldier's soldier. He had led his men through deserts, jungles, and icy battlefields. His leadership was not the kind written about in textbooks. It was lived on the ground, shoulder to shoulder with his troops. Men trusted him with their lives, not because of his rank, but because of his courage. His chest was heavy with medals, evidence of valor, resilience, and sacrifice. On that day, he was not merely a military figure. He was a national symbol, admired by thousands, feared by enemies, and deeply respected even by those who opposed him. The ceremony was meant to honor him. Rows of young cadets stood in awe, staring at the living legend they had only read about in academy manuals. Senior officers nodded with pride as he delivered his speech, his deep voice rolling across the ground like a command on the battlefield. But midway through his words, something shifted. A sudden pause. The general's voice faltered, breaking the rhythm of his carefully crafted sentences. He clutched the edge of the podium for balance. A murmur spread through the crowd, but before anyone could act, his hand shot to his chest. His knees buckled. In one horrifying moment, General Hale, the indomitable hero, the pillar of strength, collapsed. Gasps rippled across the parade ground. Soldiers who had faced bullets without flinching froze in shock. The brass band fell silent, the trumpets hanging midair as if even music was stunned. Aides rushed forward, their medals clinking as they stumbled over themselves in panic. The once-proud ceremony descended into chaos. Within seconds, medics sprinted onto the stage. Their green uniforms and medical kits stood in sharp contrast to the polished formality of the parade. Orders barked out. Oxygen was prepared. Monitors were dragged forward. The general lay sprawled on the stage, his face pale, his chest frighteningly still. The crowd's collective breath held tight. These were not ordinary men and women. They were soldiers trained to face the unimaginable. Yet none were prepared to see their leader, the man who had stood unbroken in war, rendered helpless before their eyes. The first medic knelt beside him, shouting vitals to the others. "No pulse," another cried. They began chest compressions immediately, their movements precise and trained, but the urgency in their voices betrayed desperation. More medics poured in until the stage seemed swallowed by them. 25 in total, a battalion of doctors and specialists armed with equipment, knowledge, and years of experience. And still, the general did not move. From the sidelines, officers stood frozen, their authority useless. Some whispered frantic prayers. Others clenched their fists until their knuckles whitened. The aides who had spent years by his side could do nothing but watch, their eyes wide with disbelief. Time warped. Each second seemed like an eternity. Each failed attempt another nail of dread hammered deeper into the hearts of those watching. The mighty general, who had survived gunfire, explosions, and ambushes, now lay vulnerable before his own men, struck down not by an enemy, but by the fragility of human flesh. The silence among the soldiers in formation was deafening. Not a foot moved, not a weapon shifted. They were statues, united in fear. The only sound was the frantic chorus of medics, shouting numbers, commands, and medical jargon. Hope began to slip. For years, General Hale had been the symbol of unyielding strength. To see him lying motionless was to see a nation's confidence falter. The weight of the moment pressed down like an invisible storm. If he fell today, it would not just be a personal tragedy. It would shake the spirit of everyone who had ever looked up to him. And yet, as his chest refused to rise, and the medics fought a battle they were on the verge of losing, none could have predicted that salvation would come not from rank or title, not from the seasoned professionals surrounding him, but from the quiet courage of someone barely noticed in the chaos. The stage was set, though none yet knew it. The moment General Hale's body hit the stage, the medics surged forward like a wave. They were men and women trained in the harshest conditions, prepared to save lives under fire and in chaos. But today, there were no bullets, no explosions, only silence, the suffocating silence of an audience holding its breath. The first medic checked his pulse, fingers pressed firmly against the general's neck. "Nothing," he shouted. Without hesitation, he began chest compressions, his palms pounding rhythmically against the general's sternum. Another medic tore open the general's uniform coat, revealing a chest by decades of battle but frighteningly still. "Oxygen now," barked one of the senior doctors. A mask was placed over Hale's mouth, a cylinder hissing as oxygen pumped into him. Yet his chest remained stubbornly flat. Another medic prepared an injection, his hands shaking despite years of experience. "Adrenaline, 1 milligram," he called out, plunging the syringe into the general's arm. Seconds passed. Nothing. The defibrillator pads were pressed to Hale's chest, gel smeared quickly. "Clear." The shock jolted his body upward, his limbs jerking violently before slamming back down on the stage. All eyes turned to the monitor. A flat line stared back. Again clear. Another jolt, another lifeless response. By now, the one-sworded ceremony ground had turned into a battlefield of urgency. Soldiers had formed a circle around the medics, creating a human wall to keep the chaos contained. Inside that circle, the atmosphere was suffocating. Sweat poured from brows, gloves snapped against trembling hands, and voices overlapped in frantic coordination. Each medic carried years of training, each move designed to fight death itself. But death seemed unyielding, an enemy too powerful even for them. "Get me another IV line." "Switch compressions." "Prepare atropine." Commands flew like bullets. Medics rotated, each trying to keep compressions strong and steady, refusing to give fatigue any chance. But their arms grew heavy, their spirits heavier. The general's aides hovered nearby, pale and powerless. One clutched his hat so tightly his fingers bled white. Another muttered prayers under his breath, words broken by the sound of the monitor's merciless flat tone. The soldiers in formation, trained never to break discipline, now struggled to stand straight. Some bit their lips until blood trickled, others clenched fists, veins bulging. They had faced enemies with weapons drawn, but never had they faced helplessness like this. Minute after minute dragged on. With every failed attempt, the weight of despair pressed harder. The medics had exhausted their checklist. Airway cleared, adrenaline administered, shocks delivered, oxygen supplied. Still no response. Frustration grew in the voices of the doctors. "Why isn't he coming back?" one muttered angrily, as if the general himself was defying them. Another shook his head, eyes darting to the aides as though bracing to deliver the unthinkable news. Yet no one dared stop. They could not stop. This was General Hale, the man who had carried soldiers across enemy fire, who had taken bullets meant for others, who had never surrendered. To give up on him now felt like betrayal. And so they pressed on. Every time the defibrillator paddles jolted his chest, a flicker of hope surged through the room. Every time the monitor remained flat, that hope was crushed again. The cycle repeated endlessly, hope, despair, a rhythm far than any heartbeat. The lead medic wiped his forehead, his voice growing harsher. "Keep going," he snapped, more to himself than to anyone else. But his eyes betrayed doubt. 25 medics, the finest the military had, surrounded the general, and yet not one could break through the invisible wall between life and death. Around them, the air thickened with disbelief. Was it possible that the greatest military mind of his generation, a man who had survived ambushes and assassination attempts, would be lost here, in front of his soldiers, in the safety of his own nation, during a ceremony meant to honor him? The stage groaned under the constant shuffle of boots, the hiss of oxygen, the mechanical thud of compressions. The audience beyond the soldiers' wall could not see the details, but they could feel the weight of failure. Silence stretched out among them like a vast battlefield after gunfire. Still, the medics fought. They refused to yield, throwing every ounce of training, every protocol, every ounce of human determination at death itself. But as the seconds bled into minutes, it became clear. All their knowledge, all their effort, all their equipment, it wasn't enough. And in that terrible realization, as hope teetered on the edge of collapse, one quiet pair of eyes watched from the shadows. Eyes that saw not just the chaos, but the tiny detail that everyone else had missed. Inside the circle of medics, the atmosphere grew tense, not only with the fight against death, but with the clash of authority. The general lay motionless, his chest bare under the harsh sunlight, a battlefield of wires, pads, and hands trying desperately to pull him back. Yet despite their combined knowledge, the line on the monitor refused to budge. The senior-most doctor, Colonel Strauss, barked orders with an iron tone. He had been in charge of countless emergency cases, his voice normally a pillar of control. But today, even his commands carried an edge of doubt. "Another round of adrenaline," he ordered. "We stay on protocol." One of the younger medics hesitated. "Colonel, we've already given." "I said another round," Strauss snapped, his eyes blazing. The injection went in, but again, no change. The monitor remained flat, the cruel straight line mocking every effort. Sweat dripped down Strauss's temple as he clenched his jaw. Around him, murmurs began to rise among the medics. Some wanted to deviate from protocol, to try something unconventional, something riskier. Others argued that abandoning procedure could kill the general faster. "Switch compressions," another medic called. They rotated again, the sound of palms pounding against the general's chest echoing through the tense silence. "Defibrillator charge again." "Colonel, we've already." "Do it," Strauss barked. The paddles pressed against the chest. The shock jolted the general's body once more. The room collectively leaned forward, praying for a flicker, a beat, anything. But the monitor stayed still. Despair was creeping in, and with it came the cracks in unity. "Sir, we're losing time," one medic muttered, "if we don't try." "We follow protocol," Strauss thundered, cutting him off. "Do you want his death on your hands?" That silenced them. No one wanted that responsibility. No one wanted to be remembered as the one who gambled and lost the nation's greatest soldier. And so they obeyed, even as the minutes drained away. From the sidelines, aides watched the debate unfold, their faces pale. They were men accustomed to decisions of war, but now they were helpless spectators. Some whispered prayers, others rubbed trembling hands together. The youngest aide, barely out of the academy, had tears brimming in his eyes. The soldiers who stood guard around the circle dared not move, but inside their chests their hearts pounded. These were men trained to follow authority without question. Yet they too saw the futility, the repetition, the failure. Their discipline held them still, but inside they screamed. Colonel Strauss pressed his fingers against the general's neck again, as if his own touch could will life back into him. Nothing. He swore under his breath. The weight of his position pressed heavier than ever. Every eye in that circle looked to him for leadership, for direction. And every second he hesitated, another piece of the general slipped away. It was more than a medical emergency now. It was a battle of pride, rank, and reputation. Strauss knew that if they failed, history would write that he had been in charge when the general died. And so he clung to the rules, to the procedures etched into every medical textbook, hoping that discipline would triumph where desperation could not. But the whispers grew louder. "We should try airway surgery." "No, it's too late for that." "What if it's not his heart?" "Enough," Strauss barked again, silencing them like a drill sergeant crushing dissent. His authority weighed like a chain, locking every medic into place. They obeyed, but not without glances of doubt and frustration. The aides exchanged uneasy looks. The seconds bled into minutes, and the room filled with a suffocating sense of inevitability. The greatest doctors in the military stood shoulder to shoulder, yet none could change the outcome. And still in the corner of the circle, unnoticed by most, stood a figure who did not share their blind faith in protocol. A young nurse, quiet, observant, and unburdened by rank, watched with growing unease. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her kit, but her eyes remained fixed on the general. She saw the procedures, the failures, the endless repetition. And in that endless rhythm of authority and obedience, she noticed something different, something small, something overlooked. Her heart raced as the realization sank in. But what was she to do? Speak out against doctors with years of experience? Challenge the authority of Strauss himself? Fear locked her lips, but instinct pushed against it. For while the doctors argued and the protocols repeated, the general's life slipped further away. And the truth became clear to her. If she did not act soon, no one would. Amid the storm of orders and medical jargon, she stood at the edge of the circle, almost invisible. Lieutenant, a nurse barely 6 months into her service, clutched her kit to her chest. She had been assigned to the ceremony as a standby assistant, not expected to do more than hand supplies and observe. Around her towered doctors with decades of experience, specialists decorated with honors of their own. She was the youngest, the lowest in rank, and the least expected to make a difference. And yet she could not look away. Her eyes followed every movement. She watched the chest compressions, the defibrillator shocks, the injections. She saw the rhythm, the procedure, the strict precision with which each step was carried out. She knew the textbooks they were following, she had studied them herself. But something gnawed at her, a quiet voice whispering that something was wrong, something missing. Her heart pounded as she studied the general's face, his lips faintly discolored, the way his chest rose unevenly when the mask pressed oxygen into him, the subtle twitch at his throat, easily overlooked in the chaos. To the senior doctors, the signs were drowned in the noise of procedure. But two, standing still on the sidelines, they stood out like a flare in the night. She swallowed hard. Could it be? Could she have noticed something 25 medics had missed? The thought made her stomach tighten. Who was she to question them? These were experts, seasoned in battlefields and emergency wards. She was just a nurse. Switch compressions, a medic barked. The circle rotated again. The general's chest thudded under new hands. The monitor stayed flat. His fingers gripped her kit, her nails digging into the fabric. She wanted to speak, to shout, to point out what she had seen, but the fear of humiliation held her back. If she was wrong, if she spoke out of turn, she would never recover from the shame. A young nurse daring to lecture colonels and specialists. It could end her career before it began. Yet the voice in her heart grew louder. If you stay silent, he will die. Her throat tightened. She tried to push the thought away, but it returned, stronger each time. The memory of her training flashed through her mind, a professor telling her once, "Sometimes, survival depends not on skill but on observation. See what others do not." Her gaze returned to the general. That faint obstruction, that small but critical sign in his airway, seemed clearer now. Why hadn't anyone noticed? Why were they only focusing on his heart, his pulse, his chest? Her breath quickened. She looked at Colonel Strauss, his face hardened, his authority radiating like a shield. He barked another command, refusing to break from protocol. Around him, the medics obeyed, their movements mechanical, their minds trapped inside the box of discipline. She knew if she spoke, he would shut her down. The others would laugh or glare. But if she didn't, the general's life would slip away right before her eyes. The world around her blurred. She no longer heard the band, the whispers of the crowd, or the shouts of the medics. All she could hear was the pounding of her own heartbeat. And then something inside her broke free. Her voice, small but steady, cut through the noise. "Wait," she called out. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. A silence heavier than gunfire fell over the circle. Colonel Strauss's glare landed on her, sharp and cold. "What did you say, Lieutenant?" he demanded, his tone almost mocking. Sneeze trembled, but she stood her ground. "His airway," she said, louder this time. "There's an obstruction. Look at his throat. It's not his heart, it's his airway." For a moment the room froze. Medics exchanged doubtful glances. Strauss's lips tightened, his pride wounded by the interruption. Yet's words hung in the air, impossible to ignore. Her hands shook as she added, "If you don't clear it now, nothing else will work." The silence stretched. All authority, all rank, all pride collided with one young nurse's courage. And for the first time since the general collapsed, there was something new in the air. Not despair, not protocol, but the spark of possibility. The silence after his words was deafening. 25 medics, each one more decorated and experienced than she was, turned to stare at her as if she had spoken blasphemy. The senior doctor, Colonel Strauss, straightened his posture, his eyes cold and sharp like a blade. "Lieutenant," he said, his tone clipped, "this is not the time for wild guesses." But didn't flinch. Her voice, though trembling, held conviction. "It isn't a guess, sir. Look at his throat. The oxygen isn't reaching his lungs. There's a blockage. That's why nothing else is working." A murmur rippled through the medics. Some glanced at the general's throat, others frowned, torn between discipline and doubt. Strauss, however, snapped his gaze back to the monitor. "His heart has no rhythm. Our focus stays here. Resume compressions." Two medics leaned forward to continue, but one hesitated. "Colonel," he said carefully, "she may be right. The airway does look strained." Strauss's glare silenced him. "You take advice from a nurse over a colonel. Follow protocol." Felt her cheeks burn, but she refused to back down. Every second wasted meant the general slipped closer to death. "With respect, sir, protocol is failing. We've shocked him, injected him, pumped oxygen. Nothing works. If the airway is blocked, he'll never respond." Her words cut through the chaos like a scalpel. The aides at the sidelines shifted nervously. They were not medical experts, but even they sensed the truth in her logic. The general's lips were blue, his chest barely rising despite the mask. It wasn't just his heart that was failing, something else was wrong. Strauss clenched his fists, his pride warring with reason. He had never been challenged like this, least of all by a nurse barely out of training. His reputation was on the line. To admit she might be right was to admit that he and his team had overlooked something critical. But around him, the whispers grew louder. "She might have a point. Could it be an obstruction? We've been at this for nearly 20 minutes." The circle of medics was fracturing. Authority had kept them united until now, but doubt gnawed at the edges. Stepped forward, her voice stronger this time. "I can clear it, please. Just give me one chance." Strauss turned to her, fury in his eyes. "You are out of line, Lieutenant. One chance could cost him everything." Met his gaze, her own eyes burning with determination. "He's already dying, sir. What more is there to lose?" The words hit like a strike of lightning. The aides froze, the medics exchanged glances, and even Strauss seemed momentarily shaken. Her logic was undeniable. One of the older medics, his hands trembling from endless compressions, finally spoke. "Colonel, she's right. We've tried everything else. Let her try." Strauss's jaw tightened, the muscles in his face rigid with resistance. The weight of authority pressed on him. If he agreed and she failed, his command would be tarnished forever. But if he refused and the general died, history would ask why he silenced the one voice that might have saved him. He looked down at the general, pale and lifeless on the stage. Then slowly, his head turned back toward. "Show me," he said, his voice low but edged with warning. The medics shifted aside, opening the circle just enough for her to step in. His legs trembled as she moved forward, but her hands steadied. She could feel the weight of every eye on her, the doctors, the soldiers, the aides, the silent crowd beyond. She knelt beside the general, her gaze fixed on the faint obstruction she had noticed earlier. Her fingers moved carefully, prepared for resistance. The world seemed to shrink until there was nothing but her, the general, and the breath he had been. Behind her, Colonel Strauss folded his arms, his expression unreadable. Around her, 25 medics watched in silence, some doubtful, some hopeful. The air was heavy with anticipation. For the first time since the general's collapse, the course of his fate rested not in the hands of decorated specialists, but in the courage of a young nurse who refused to stay silent. And as reached for the overlooked sign of life, the battlefield shifted. Authority no longer mattered. Rank no longer mattered. What mattered was whether she was right, and whether her hands could succeed where 25 others had failed. The air inside the circle felt heavier than iron. Words still lingered, challenging not just the protocol but the authority of every decorated medic present. For a moment, no one moved. The only sounds were the hiss of oxygen, the faint buzz of the defibrillator charging again, and the pounding of hearts that knew a man's life was slipping away. Colonel Strauss's jaw flexed, his lips pressed into a hard line. His eyes narrowed on like a predator ready to strike. "Lieutenant," he said slowly, each word laced with restrained fury, "you are dangerously close to insubordination." Swallowed but didn't retreat. "With respect, sir, insubordination doesn't matter if the patient dies." Gasps echoed among the aides. A nurse, barely 24, had just spoken to a colonel as though he were her equal. Strauss's face reddened, his pride bristling. But before he could retort, one of the senior medics interjected, his voice hesitant. She might be right, Colonel. We've exhausted the entire resuscitation protocol. If it's an airway issue, none of this will work." Strauss spun on him, his glare sharp enough to cut steel. "And you think we should gamble the general's life on the hunch of a nurse?" The medic faltered, unable to answer. His pulse thundered in her ears, but her voice grew steadier. "It's not a hunch. Look at his throat. His chest rises unevenly, his lips are cyanotic. He's not getting air. You can shock his heart 100 times and it won't matter. Please let me clear it." Around her, the circle of medics shifted uncomfortably. Some avoided Strauss's eyes, others exchanged wary glances. Authority was colliding with reason, and no one wanted to be crushed in between. The aides whispered furiously on the sidelines. They weren't doctors, but they understood desperation. The youngest aide, his voice shaking, whispered, "If she sees something, why not try? What harm is left?" Strauss heard it, his fists clenched. His career, his authority, his reputation, all were bound up in this moment. He had led this team of 25 specialists, and now a nurse threatened to overturn everything with a single observation. If she was wrong, it would be remembered as his greatest failure. If she was right, history would ask how he had missed it. "Colonel," another medic spoke up quietly, "we can't ignore her. At this point, what's left?" The words cut deep. Strauss's gaze flicked to the general's face, pale, lifeless, lips edged in blue. His chest, once the symbol of unyielding strength, now barely stirred under the hiss of oxygen. The monitor's flat line stretched on like an accusation. The battle was no longer just against death. It was against pride, against fear of being wrong. Strauss's voice came low, almost a growl. "If I allow this and she fails, every one of you will have blood on your hands." Stepped closer, kneeling beside the general. Her hands hovered near his throat, but she didn't act without permission. She met Strauss's eyes, steady and unflinching. "If you don't allow this, sir, he dies anyway. The difference is whether we tried." The silence was unbearable. Seconds felt like hours. 25 medics stared at their leader, waiting for his command. Soldiers at the perimeter stood stiff, unable to see details but sensing the tension. Even the crowd beyond the human wall seemed to hold its breath. Finally, Strauss exhaled, the sound heavy with defeat. His pride cracked under the crushing weight of reality. "Do it," he muttered, his voice reluctant, almost bitter. "But if this fails, it's on you." Nodded once, determination flashing in her eyes. She didn't care about blame, reputation, or authority. All she cared about was the man lying lifeless before her. The medics shifted to make space, their movements uncertain, some skeptical, others hopeful. Strauss stepped back, folding his arms, his expression a storm of anger and unease. Knelt fully now, her trembling hands finally steadying as training and instinct took over. She reached toward the overlooked sign, prepared to prove her conviction. Every gaze in the circle fixed on her. 25 medics, a colonel, aides, soldiers, and beyond them, a crowd that would soon learn whether courage or protocol had the final word. The weight of the nation pressed onto her shoulders. And with one decisive breath began, leaned closer, her breath shallow, her mind locked into focus. Every movement mattered now. 25 pairs of eyes bore into her, half filled with doubt, half with a fragile hope that she might succeed where they had failed. The general's face was still, lips edged in blue, his skin pale beneath the harsh surgical lights. His chest rose faintly but without strength. The heart monitor droned its merciless tone, a sound that seemed to scream failure into the silence. Her gloved hands moved with careful precision. She tilted his head slightly, scanning the airway. And then there it was. A subtle obstruction lodged deeper than anyone had looked, nearly invisible in the chaos. Her pulse spiked. She hadn't been wrong. "Something blocking it," she whispered, her voice taut with urgency. "I see it." The medics leaned forward, some straining to glimpse what she had found. Strauss's eyes narrowed, his face unreadable. Reached for the laryngoscope, one of the medics passed her. Her hands trembled as she inserted it, the harsh light catching the obstruction. A fragment of food, small but deadly, lodged just at the edge of his airway. Her stomach nodded, so simple, so obvious, and yet in the chaos overlooked by 25 trained specialists. She slid the forceps in, her fingers steady, every nerve screaming with pressure. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the aides on the sidelines stood frozen, afraid to breathe. Then, in one swift motion, she grasped the fragment and pulled it free. The obstruction slipped into view, glistening under the surgical light. Gasps erupted around the circle. "There it is," one medic exclaimed. "She was right," another whispered, almost in disbelief. Didn't pause to celebrate. She tossed the obstruction aside and shouted, "Bag him now." A medic immediately pressed the bag to the general's face, pumping oxygen into his lungs. This time, his chest rose fully, the sound of air rushing through his throat loud and blessedly clear. The aides clutched each other, their eyes wide. The medics stared at the monitor, willing it to change. Strauss's jaw tightened as his gaze flicked from the nurse to the screen. The flat line continued, 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Then a flicker, a tiny blip. "Wait, look," one medic cried. Another blip, then another. The flat tone broke, replaced by the irregular but miraculous sound of a heartbeat returning. Froze, her breath caught in her throat. It was working. The general's chest began to rise with rhythm, his face slowly regaining color. The monitor's beeping grew steadier, louder, filling the room with hope. The aides nearly collapsed with relief, clutching each other in joy. Some medics dropped their instruments, their hands trembling as they realized what had just happened. His eyes burned with tears, but she blinked them back, keeping her focus on the patient. "Keep ventilating. Check his pulse." One medic pressed his fingers to the general's neck, his voice cracking. "Strong pulse. He's back." The words detonated through the room like cannon fire. Relief surged, but so did shame. 25 trained professionals, and none had seen what she had. The young nurse, dismissed as inexperienced, had pulled the general back from the brink. Strauss stood rigid, his face pale. His authority, his certainty, shattered in an instant. But he said nothing, his pride caught in his throat. The aides crowded closer, their relief transforming into awe. They looked not at the medics nor at the colonel, but at the nurse who refused to be silenced, who had risked her reputation and the chain of command to save their leader. exhaled a trembling breath, her hands finally steady. She glanced at the monitor, then at the man whose life now beat beneath her fingertips. The impossible had happened. Behind her, the whispers began. She saved him. The nurse, she did it. If she hadn't spoken up. The words grew louder, a ripple of realization spreading through the circle and beyond. Soon, the aides would carry the tale outside the tent, and within hours, the story of a young nurse who saw what 25 medics missed would travel farther than she could imagine. But for now, she remained kneeling beside the general, the weight of what had just happened settling into her chest. She had acted against orders, against authority, and against fear, and she had won. For the first time since the collapse, hope filled the room. The general lived. And the nurse who dared to speak had rewritten the ending. The tent no longer felt suffocating. The relentless flatline had been replaced by the steady beat of a living heart, and that sound, sharp, rhythmic, undeniable, filled the air like music. For a long moment, no one spoke. The circle of medics stood in stunned silence, staring at the man they had believed lost. Still knelt at the general's side, her hands resting lightly on the rails of the gurney. Her body trembled with exhaustion, but her eyes never left the monitor. She could scarcely believe it herself. Against every odd, against every order, the general was breathing again. One of the aides finally broke the silence with a whisper. "He's alive." His voice cracked, thick with emotion. Others echoed the words, murmuring them like a prayer. The medics, once so certain, looked at each other with a mixture of relief and shame. They had followed every rule, every protocol, every step of their training and still failed. The simplest sign, the one hidden in plain sight, had been overlooked until dared to speak. Colonel Strauss's face was rigid, his lips pressed tight. His pride had been gutted. For years his word had been law, his judgment unquestioned. But now he stood in silence while a young nurse's defiance had brought back the man he could not save. His jaw clenched, and though his eyes flicked too, he could not bring himself to speak. Minutes passed. The general's breathing steadied, the bluish tint fading from his lips. Medics adjusted lines and monitors, working quickly but carefully now as though afraid to undo what had been achieved. Stayed close, her every nerve still on edge. Then a stir. The general's hand twitched, his eyelids fluttered. The aides gasped aloud, their voices choked with disbelief. Leaned closer, her heart hammering in her chest. Slowly, painfully, his eyes opened. For a moment they were clouded, searching. But then they focused, landing on her face. His lips moved, no sound at first, just a faint motion. She bent closer. "Breathe," she whispered softly, steadying her voice. "You're safe." A ragged inhale rattled from his throat, followed by a weak exhale. His chest rose again, stronger this time. The monitor beeped in rhythm. The aides began to weep openly, some clasping their hands as though witnessing a miracle. Strauss finally found his voice, low and rough. "Stabilize him. Secure the airway." His words carried none of the authority they once held, only the mechanics of duty. The medics moved quickly, but their eyes kept darting to, silent acknowledgments passing between them. They knew who had saved him, and so did everyone else. The general, still weak, turned his gaze back to her. His lips formed a single word, fragile but clear enough. "Thank you." Her throat tightened. She swallowed hard, blinking back tears. "Just rest, sir. That's all you need to do now." The aides stepped forward, their gratitude spilling over in whispered praises. She saved him. She saw what no one else did. It was her. The words spread through the tent, leaping from aide to medic to soldier. Beyond the flaps, murmurs began to ripple into the waiting crowd. Soon, the world outside would know. Strauss stood stiffly, his arms crossed, but his silence betrayed the storm inside him. He had been challenged and proven wrong, not by another colonel, not by a senior physician, but by the youngest nurse in the room. And though he did not say it, he knew history would not remember his resistance. It would remember her courage. Finally sat back, exhaustion washing over her. The adrenaline that had fueled her was gone, leaving only trembling limbs and a heart full of disbelief. She hadn't sought recognition, only the chance to save a life. But now, in the eyes of everyone present, she was no longer just a nurse. She was the one who refused to be silent, the one who saw what others missed, the one who gave a nation back its leader. Outside, the first cheer rose from the crowd as word spread. The general lived. The sound swelled, echoing like thunder through the camp, carrying with it a story that would outlive the moment. And at the center of it all sat quietly, humbled, knowing only one truth. She had done what she was meant to do. She had seen, she had spoken, and she had acted, and because of that, a man who had been given up for dead drew breath once more.